James Connor and Olivia Hayes appeared to be ordinary citizens, respected in their neighborhoods, trusted by their colleagues, and invisible to suspicion. But behind closed doors, they were orchestrating one of the most sophisticated cocaine networks Liverpool had ever seen, a secret empire that stretched from quiet suburbs to the city docks and threatened to crumble the entire underworld until the police struck. The first signs of the Liverpool drug empire appeared so quietly that almost no one noticed. At first the changes were small: a sudden rise in late-night traffic on empty streets, unfamiliar cars parked near abandoned buildings, and unusual payments being transferred between minor criminals who normally had little money to move around. Nothing about these clues seemed dramatic on its own, but to the detectives working long shifts in the city's organized crime unit, the pattern felt wrong. Something was growing beneath the surface, something bigger than the usual street-level dealing that officers saw every week. As the months passed, the signs became difficult to ignore. Reports of cocaine found in places that rarely saw drugs confused officers. Small seizures were happening far apart, but were strangely identical in packaging and purity. It was as if someone had copied and pasted the same batch of cocaine across several neighborhoods. Detectives began pulling surveillance footage from the areas where the packets were discovered, and one detail immediately jumped out. The same style of dark-tinted SUV kept appearing at the edges of the footage, often leaving the scene minutes before a stash was found. The plates were different each time, which meant someone had taken real care to stay invisible. More worrying was the behavior of the local gangs. Groups that normally fought constantly had suddenly gone quiet. Turf disputes stopped overnight. Leaders who had been unpredictable and loud were now moving carefully, using new phones, changing addresses, and avoiding public places. Something or someone had forced them into order. Detectives knew that only a powerful force could calm gangs that had spent years refusing to cooperate with each other. The idea that one organization had taken control of such a chaotic environment caused concern at police headquarters. Whoever was behind this shift understood both drugs and people well enough to control the city without drawing attention. To understand the scale of what they were dealing with, police began following the money. They tracked purchases of high-end vehicles made in cash, storage units rented under false identities, and sudden spikes in warehouse electricity usage, often a sign that something illegal is being produced or stored inside. What they found connected many small-time criminals who had never worked together before. It was as though someone had built a chain of workers who all played tiny roles without ever meeting one another. This structure made the network extremely difficult to dismantle. If one member was caught, they could only reveal a tiny fragment of the operation. The most troubling clue came from the docks. Several containers coming through the port were taking longer than usual to pass assassins. Not because they had been flagged, but because the companies receiving them had changed hands in strange ways. Businesses that once had stable owners were suddenly registered to new individuals with barely any background information. The containers these companies received were always clean on paper, filled with everyday goods, but detectives knew the port was the perfect place to hide something far more valuable. The growing suspicion that cocaine was entering the city through these shipments added a new level of urgency to the investigation. By this point, police understood they were not dealing with a loose group of criminals. They were facing a hidden empire that had quietly threaded itself through the city's transport routes, financial system, and criminal landscape. Every new detail made the network seem larger, smarter, and harder to detect. The thought that this empire might continue expanding pushed detectives to dig deeper, working long nights and reviewing endless footage in search of the one mistake that could expose the people behind it. What had begun as a few strange clues had transformed into the hunt for an organization powerful enough to reshape Liverpool's underworld from the shadows. The investigation into the growing drug empire took a dramatic turn when police uncovered something that challenged every assumption they had been working with. For months, detectives had believed the network was controlled by a well-known street figure with a long history in Liverpool's criminal world. His name appeared repeatedly in low-level conversations, rumors and encrypted messages intercepted during routine surveillance. Everything pointed to him, until the evidence led in a completely different direction, one that none of the team had expected. It began with a quiet stakeout at a property believed to be nothing more than a small stash house. The location was ordinary, tucked between two rundown buildings and often overlooked by anyone passing through the area. Detectives expected to see familiar faces from local gangs coming and going with packets of cocaine or bags of cash. For several nights nothing unusual happened. The same car arrived at the same time, the same man picked up a small package, and the same lights flickered in the back room. It was all routine, predictable, and almost boring. Then on the fifth night a vehicle pulled up that instantly raised suspicion. A brand new luxury car with private plates and tinted windows that looked out of place in such a rundown street. When the door opened and the driver stepped out, the surveillance team froze. The person walking toward the stash house was not a gang member, not a criminal known to the unit, not someone with a reputation for violence or drug dealing. Instead, it was a respected businessman who owned several shipping and logistics companies along the Mersey. His face had appeared in local newspapers for sponsoring charity events, supporting youth sports programs, and announcing expansions in his company's shipping operations. He was the type of person the public trusted, the type of figure who gave speeches about community development and economic growth. His presence at a stash house made no sense. Detectives checked and rechecked the footage, convinced there had been a mistake, but the more they watched, the more obvious it became. The man was interacting with individuals connected to the drug network. He was not there by accident. His arrival changed everything. If someone of his status was involved, the operation was far more organized than anyone had believed. As investigators dug deeper into his businesses, new layers of complexity began to unfold. His shipping companies controlled dozens of containers that moved in and out of Liverpool's port every week. Most of them were filled with perfectly legal goods, clothing, electronics, furniture, and construction materials. But the timing of certain shipments began to raise questions. Containers coming from specific regions always arrived days before spikes in cocaine distribution across the city. The pattern was too precise to ignore. Financial analysts were brought into the investigation, and their findings revealed another twist. While his main company showed steady and believable profits, several smaller companies under his name displayed strange patterns. Large payments moved through them quickly, sometimes appearing and disappearing within hours. These transactions were routed through different countries, often those with loose financial regulations. The structure looked clean on paper, but to an experienced analyst, it suggested laundering on a massive scale. Investigators also learned that the businessman rarely visited the same office twice in a week. He used different vehicles, moved through the docks late at night, and had access to restricted zones usually reserved for high-clearance workers. Surveillance teams followed him for weeks, documenting how he blended legitimate business activity with the hidden movements of an underground network. He met with trusted employees, monitored the arrival of containers, and visited properties connected to known criminals, all while maintaining a spotless public image. The discovery forced police to rethink everything they believed about the Liverpool drug empire. The operation was not being run from the streets, but from boardrooms, warehouses, and shipping docks. It was controlled by someone who understood logistics, finance, and how to hide illegal operations inside legitimate ones. What had once looked like a chaotic drug ring now resembled a sophisticated international syndicate with a polished leader at its center. This unexpected mastermind changed the direction of the entire investigation. Detectives realized that they were not chasing a gang, they were chasing a businessman who had built a criminal empire behind the cover of respectability. And the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that taking him down would require more than just surveillance. It would require unraveling a web of secrets that stretched far beyond Liverpool's streets. The strength of the drug empire began to weaken long before the suspects realized it. At first, the organization operated with flawless precision. Every courier, driver, and handler stuck to strict routines, following schedules that left almost no room for error. But the larger the network grew, the harder it became to control every detail. Small mistakes, the kind that could be ignored in a smaller operation, slowly piled up and created cracks that investigators were quick to notice. What began as tiny imperfections soon evolved into the very weaknesses that would bring the entire empire down. One of the first major breaks in the case came from an incident that seemed unimportant at the time. A courier driving a routine delivery got into a minor traffic accident after swerving to avoid a pedestrian. Panicked by the situation and fearing police attention, he abandoned the car and ran. To him, this meant escaping trouble, but to detectives, the abandoned vehicle was a gift. The car appeared perfectly normal on the outside, but a search revealed a hidden compartment built into the route. Inside, officers found coded notes, route maps marked with precise drop-off locations, and a ledger of cash payments. The courier had unknowingly exposed the network's internal structure. Around the same time, an unexpected fire erupted inside a warehouse located in an industrial district. The building had been months apart. Delivery logs had been altered, and in several cases, the receiving companies had no legitimate business activity that justified such frequent shipments. The deeper investigators dug into these inconsistencies, the more they uncovered a web of shell companies and temporary workers hired under false identities. What once looked like a smooth, legitimate operation now revealed a patchwork of rushed decisions and sloppy cover-ups. Some members of the organization also began making costly emotional mistakes. A mid-level handler purchased luxury items far beyond his reported income, drawing attention to himself. Another was caught on camera meeting with individuals outside his assigned group, breaking the strict rules that once kept the network airtight. A few members even started arguing internally over missing shipments and delayed payments. Tension within the organization created miscommunication, and miscommunication led to more errors. The empire that had seemed so disciplined at first was slowly unraveling from the inside. Detectives took advantage of every slip. They pieced together maps, financial trails, forged documents, and hours of surveillance footage until a full picture of the organization's layout began to form. For the first time, they could clearly see how each part of the network connected to the next. They identified safe houses, transport routes, financial managers, couriers, and overseers. The once shadowy operation was now becoming visible from every angle. The cracks in the empire were no longer small fractures. They had widened into pathways leading directly to the core of the organization. The team realized they were getting closer to uncovering all 21 key figures involved. What had started as scattered clues had developed into a detailed roadmap of a collapsing criminal structure. The empire was beginning to fall apart, and the investigators were now ready to move in for the final blow. Operation Iron Tide began as a plan drawn across whiteboards, maps, and stacks of confidential files, but by the time it was ready to launch, it had become one of the largest coordinated actions Liverpool had seen in years. Detectives knew they had only one chance to strike. The network was fragile but still dangerous, and if even one suspect realized a raid was coming, the entire operation could collapse. Every phone call, every door knock, and every movement had to be timed perfectly. Precision would decide whether the empire fell in a single morning or slipped away to rebuild itself somewhere else. The planning phase took weeks. Officers from multiple divisions came together, each bringing details from their own investigations. Surveillance teams shared footage, financial analysts provided timelines, and intelligence officers predicted how each suspect would react under pressure. The group created profiles for all 21 targets, mapping out where they lived, who they trusted, and how likely they were to flee. A central command post was established to keep every team synchronized. Radios were tested, communication codes finalized, and transport vehicles prepared. Nothing was left unchecked. When the day of the operation arrived, the city was still asleep. Streetlights cast long shadows across empty roads as unmarked vans spread quietly through Liverpool, parking in alleys, side streets, and behind industrial buildings. Officers wore dark clothing and carried specialized equipment designed for swift entry. Helicopters were already in the air, hovering at a distance, and waiting for the order to move in. The stillness of the early morning created a tense atmosphere, as if the entire city were holding its breath. At precisely the planned moment, the first wave of teams acted. In the suburbs, officers approached houses believed to be safe locations for cash storage. In the city center, another group targeted apartments used as meeting points for mid-level coordinators. On the outskirts, heavily secured warehouses were surrounded by tactical units. Each location required a different type of entry. Some doors were opened with quiet tools to avoid alerting neighbors, while others were forced quickly to prevent suspects from destroying evidence. The operation expanded across the city like a synchronized clockwork mechanism. Inside many buildings, officers found exactly what they expected: cocaine wrapped in plastic, bundles of cash piled in drawers, encrypted phones hidden behind false panels, and documents detailing drug shipments disguised as commercial goods. In one storage unit, shelves held packages stacked with mathematical precision, each marked with coded labels matching entries in the partially burned ledger recovered earlier. The physical evidence the network had worked so hard to hide was now exposed. Some suspects tried to escape. A driver attempted to flee in a high-performance car, but was tracked immediately by a helicopter, which guided ground units to intercept him. Another suspect ran through back gardens, hoping to disappear into a maze of fences and sheds. But officers had already blocked every exit. Even those who tried to hide behind locked doors or barricaded rooms were quickly overwhelmed by trained teams. The order of arrests mattered, and the sequence worked flawlessly. No warnings were sent, no phones were smashed in time, and no evidence was destroyed. One of the most significant arrests occurred at the docks. The businessman who had orchestrated much of the operation believed he was arriving for a routine shipment review. Instead, officers were waiting. His access card was deactivated moments before his arrival, preventing him from entering secure zones. He was arrested calmly, surrounded by containers he had once used to hide his criminal operations. The downfall of such a carefully built facade marked a turning point for the entire investigation. As the morning progressed, the command post confirmed that all 21 suspects had been taken into custody. The operation had unfolded so smoothly that, for many in the city, the entire event passed without notice. But for the investigators who had spent months chasing shadows, the success of Operation Iron Tide was the moment everything finally came together. The Empire had been struck at every point, leaving no room for escape. By the time the sun rose fully over Liverpool, the drug network that once seemed untouchable no longer existed. The arrests, evidence, and coordinated precision ensured that the organization had been dismantled from top to bottom. What remained was the sense that a major battle had been won, even though the wider war against organized crime was far from over. In the days following Operation Iron Tide, investigators believed they had reached the end of a long and exhausting journey. Every major figure in the Liverpool drug empire was behind bars. Hundreds of pieces of evidence had been secured, and the network's communication channels had gone silent. Newspapers praised the success, residents felt a renewed sense of safety, and the city appeared to return to its usual rhythm. But inside the investigation room, analysts were still sorting through mountains of documents, encrypted devices, and digital logs. What they discovered next would shift the tone from victory to unease, proving that the story was far from finished. Among the seized materials was a collection of financial records that initially seemed like routine evidence: transaction histories, business statements, and export documents from the shipping companies tied to the operation. Most of it confirmed what detectives already knew, but one folder stood out because it did not match the rest. The transactions were larger, moved through different countries, and carried codes that analysts had never seen before in the Liverpool network. These codes appeared repeatedly across dozens of pages, suggesting they were part of a separate system entirely. The more analysts examined the records, the clearer it became that these transactions were not linked to any of the 21 suspects already in custody. The breakthrough came when a data specialist traced the codes back to a set of offshore financial services operating out of another continent. The pattern revealed an individual whose name did not appear in any previous reports, surveillance logs, or intercepted messages. This unknown partner had been managing the flow of money that kept the entire empire running. While the businessman in Liverpool had directed local operations, this hidden figure had handled the international side, moving funds, approving shipments, and coordinating with suppliers abroad. The structure of the syndicate was larger and more complex than investigators had ever imagined. What made the discovery even more unsettling was how carefully this person had concealed their identity. They never traveled under the same name twice, never used a phone number longer than a few days, and never communicated directly with any of the local members. Instead, they relied on layers of intermediaries, encrypted platforms, and temporary accounts that vanished almost as soon as they were created. The evidence left behind was not enough to reveal their real identity, only enough to confirm their existence. It was a twist that shifted the case from a local victory to the beginning of a global pursuit. Investigators shared their findings with international agencies, sparking conversations about wider networks that might be connected to the Liverpool operation. The patterns resembled those used by large-scale cartels operating across multiple continents. The possibility that the dismantled Liverpool empire was only one branch of a sprawling international system forced officials to rethink the entire case. Instead of closing the files, they created new ones, each dedicated to untangling the final routes, supply chains, and communication methods used by the unknown mastermind. Meanwhile, the public celebrated the arrests, unaware that the investigation had quietly expanded beyond city borders. Officers who had worked tirelessly on the ground now found themselves preparing for international cooperation, sharing intelligence with agencies unfamiliar with Liverpool's criminal landscape. What had once seemed like a local crime story had evolved into a global mission involving multiple countries and countless new leads. Yet despite the growing complexity, the success of Operation Iron Tide remained undeniable. The 21 arrests had completely dismantled the Liverpool arm of the network. Streets once influenced by the empire became quieter, and the flow of cocaine into the city dropped sharply. For the detectives who had followed every clue, chased every lead, and pushed through months of uncertainty, the victory was meaningful. They had taken down an empire that once seemed impossible to touch. But the final twist, the existence of a hidden partner operating far beyond Liverpool's borders, served as a reminder that organized crime rarely ends with a single operation. The fall of the local empire had revealed only one part of a much larger structure, and while the city slept more peacefully, investigators knew that somewhere across the world another figure was already rebuilding, adjusting, and preparing for the next move. The Liverpool chapter had closed, but the story that had begun in the shadows was still unfolding, stretching far beyond